Okay, we're connected. Couple of minutes to go, and we'll start at the dot of 6. No Demawaro.
It's 6 o'clock.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So we're going to continue on with the second installment on an examination of the Saṃyojana, the fetters, and to recap, the 10 fetters are particular obstacles or defilements that keep us bound to samsara. And they're an important list to understand because they cross-reference with the 4 stages of awakening, in that each of the stages either eliminates or reduces some of the fetters until with arahantship they're all destroyed. The first 3 fetters are sometimes called the lower fetters, and they're completely eradicated with the attainment of stream entry or sotapanna. They all, in one way or another, revolve around purification of view, ditthi, because stream entry in it's probably its most fundamental aspect is a purification of the view. So it can also be called the opening of the Dhamma eye. It represents that moment in which a practitioner first glimpses the unconditioned. And that may be at this time just the barest glimpse, the curtains part, and the person sees, oh, there is an unconditioned. And it's at the later stages in which it is more fully entered into and understood. But there can be no doubt in the mind of a sotapanna that there is such a thing as the unconditioned, or nibbana. And that has a fundamental effect in the depth of the being, a turning around in the depth that changes the understanding and the view forever. It's a permanent shift. Samsara is now more fully understood because nibbana has been glimpsed. So last time we spoke about the first fetter in the list, which is Sakkaya Ditthi, or personality view, which relates to the sense of a self. a conception of a self. And today we're going to talk about Sīlabbataparāmāsa. The first thing that needs to be clarified here is translation. I think this particular fetter it's very difficult to get a translation that's both literal and also conveys the actual deeper meaning. The translation "rite and ritual clinging" is become standard, and it's quite misleading in many ways. Many people will say, "Oh, I don't cling to rites and rituals. I don't sacrifice billy goats in the backyard or do any kind of mumbo jumbo. So I'm free of that." Whereas that's a misunderstanding by projecting the most obvious manifestation of Sīlabbataparāmāsa and making it the entirety. So first of all, let's look at the literal breakdown of the word. Sila is, of course, ethics, it's morality. We talk about like taking the precepts as sila, and it's one of the essential stages of the path. Bata is the grammatical transformation of the word vata with a V. Oftentimes when Pali words are put into compounds, they're changed a bit for various rules of orthography we don't need to get into. But vata refers to duties which should be done. So sila and vata together are the do's and don'ts. Like sila is don't do these bad things, and vata is you should do these good things. These are your duties. So obviously there's nothing wrong with keeping sila and vata. In fact, it's essential. We have to have good sila, and we should do our duties. Sila vata. The third part of the compound is paramasa, which could be understood as dependence on or reliance on. And I've seen different attempts to translate, to get around the problem and translate Sīlabbataparāmāsa more meaningfully. One I heard a kind of a playful suggestion that Ajahn Sucitto gave in a talk that I attended once. He called Sīlabbataparāmāsa structures and systems fondling. And what I think really Sīlabbataparāmāsa is pointing to is to have a mechanical or mechanistic, ritualistic or superstitious view of practice. If one has the implicit or explicit, just as we had the self view can be implicit or explicit, so can Sīlabbataparāmāsa. And I think in many cases it's very implicit. The person doesn't even really understand that that's what they're doing. But if you have a mechanistic view of practice, so that you're doing the practice by rote, you're following these instructions and doing these practices according to a fixed formula, and expecting that there will be an automatic result, then this is reducing the practice to a ritual and taking the essence out of it, taking the liberating quality out of it. This is actually a subtle problem because we have in the Buddhist tradition, going back to the Visuddhimagga at least, we have a long history of specific meditation techniques. And many of you will be familiar with one or more of these. And there's nothing wrong with these. In fact, they're very skillful. They're very useful. They're essential, I would say, to master some technique of meditation rather than just do it entirely free form from the beginning. But one should recall the Buddha's simile of the raft, that a traveler comes across a stream, a river, and in blocking his progress on the journey. So he makes a raft out of bamboo that he cuts down and floats across the river and then carries on. And the raft is a example. There are several well-known and well-practiced and excellent techniques of vipassana meditation out there. The one I'm most familiar with is the Mahasi method, or the noting method, but there's also Goenka and Pa'ak and several others that are less well known. They're specific techniques or methods of meditation. But I think the best way to regard them is that's not the meditation itself. That's a technique for accessing a certain state of mind. And vipassana means clear seeing, and it's best understood not as a meditation per se, but as a state of mind that we're trying to access. And the technique is a way to get in the door, to develop this state of mind that is the clear seeing, which could be defined as objective, non-reactive observation of phenomena as they present themselves to consciousness. This is similar thing could be said about samatha meditation, that when we're developing samatha, we're trying to access a state of mind, which is samadhi, which is stability, the stillness and unification of mind. And the methods we use to get there are the techniques, are a stepping stone to access that state of mind. So that's how we can apply this to the meditation. And the Sīlabbataparāmāsa, I think in deep stages of meditation, can become a real hindrance. It can be a real obstacle to letting go. One is clinging to the raft and is unable to climb onto the far shore. So that paramasa, meaning dependence on or reliance on, means that we don't put our reliance of liberation or awakening on any particular ritualistic formula. It is, in fact, impossible. If we study the stages of insight as laid out in the Visuddhimagga, for example, the practice of vipassana will take you as far as equanimity about formations, which is a very profoundly peaceful, pleasant abiding. And it doesn't feel like you're meditating anymore, but you're clearly aware of everything that arises. But there's no sense of putting forth an effort, but the meditation is flawless. And what happens with the mind at that point, that's as far as you can get by effort. That's as far as the raft can take you. But then what happens to the mind in the Visuddhimagga gives the simile of navigators in ancient times using a land-finding crow. They would take birds, usually crows, on board the ship in cages, and when they were way out at sea beyond sight of land, if they thought they were getting close to land, they would release a crow, and they would watch which way he went. So he flies off to the north, and if he comes back, that means there's no land to the north. So then he rests a while, then he flies out again, maybe to the east. And eventually he won't come back anymore, and they know there's land in that direction. He's found a safe harbor on the other side. So they'll steer the ship that way. So this is what the mind does, according to Visuddhimagga, when it's in equanimity about formations. The consciousness keeps jumping out because it's not tightly bound anymore to the samsaric process. It keeps jumping out, and eventually it finds nibbana, the unconditioned, and then in that metaphorical sense, it doesn't return. So the liberation occurs, but this any act of will or by following any procedure. It's something the mind naturally does when it's in that state. And if one were to try and force things at that point, try and follow some kind of formulaic procedure, then it would only thwart the process, and there would be no liberation. That Sīlabbataparāmāsa also, I've been speaking about how it manifests in meditation, and that's probably the most significant aspect, but it also manifests in the life generally, the sense of doing something mechanically, following the law rather than the spirit, not truly releasing into whatever is happening, but clinging or depending on following a fixed procedure. Ritualism, in its obvious form, is actually a part of the Buddhist religion. It's part of all religions. It's a ritual aspect. And rituals can be very brightening and encouraging to the mind. They can be inspiring. Rituals like we do here, morning chanting. We light the candles and incense and bow and do some chanting in Pali, and that's all ritualistic behavior. And by performing rituals like that, that does not imply Silabbataparāmāsa. Having a wise attitude toward ritual this is something wholesome that I'm doing to remind myself and others and encourage the mind, brighten the mind. It's a wholesome, useful thing to do, but it has no deliberate magical power. You have to remember too, when the Buddha laid down these teachings, the context he was in, he was reacting, and there are some suttas where he specifically talks about this, particularly the Sutta Nipata, but he's reacting against the Vedic religion, which was the dominant religion at the time. It was we used to say a proto-Hindu religion that was very ritualistic. And they actually had, the Vedas are full of formulas for ritual. They actually had the belief that if you performed a ritual correctly down to the last gesture and the last syllable, then the gods were compelled to grant your request. So you want the birth of a healthy son, or you want good yield from your crops, then you pay a Brahmin priest to do this ritual, and he'll sacrifice an animal and sprinkle water and do chanting and do various mudras and gestures with his hands. And if he does it flawlessly, you're guaranteed to get the result. If you don't get the result, all that means is he didn't do the ritual correctly. He made some mistake somewhere along the line. So this is an extreme example of Sīlabbataparāmāsa, the idea that performing a ritual in a mechanical way and with exact attention to every minor detail will guarantee a result. And there can be a ritualism in trivial ways in daily life, and I think everybody falls into that to some degree. You have your daily rituals. You know, maybe you have a cup of coffee when you first get up in the morning, and you make it a certain way, and you sit in a certain place and drink your coffee. It's kind of a little ritual, and it's quite harmless if you don't become obsessive about it. Well, there is actually a psychiatric disorder called obsessive compulsive disorder, and that's like an extreme form of Silabbataparāmāsa, where the person feels compelled to perform certain acts or gestures or say certain words in a ritualistic manner, and they have a feeling that something terrible will happen if they don't do it. And that kind of a mind stream is an extreme example of Silabbataparāmāsa. Another case that I've seen, you occasionally encounter people who absolutely refuse to perform ritual, thinking that they're being very high-minded. So they won't bow, they won't light incense. They just, this is all wrong. We're not doing that. And that in itself, that utter refusal to participate in ritual is a form of rite and ritual clinging. It's Silabbataparāmāsa, because it's a negative form. One is psychically depending on non-performance of a ritual. So there's no flexibility in the mind. And that's what, in the end, that's what Silabbataparāmāsa robs the mind of, is freedom and movement and flexibility, and the ability to strike out in a new direction. Now, one can easily become caught in a rut and follow the path of least resistance all the time. So with the attainment of stream entry, then Silabbataparāmāsa is done, it's finished, just as Saṃyojana II is, because the stream enter glimpses Nibbana, and he realizes, oh, I didn't do this by any ritual means. This is not the result of ritualistic following. So the mind is liberated from that false conception. The idea that you can do something to attain Nibbana. There's some method or means to attain Nibbana. Ajahn Chah, one of his agricultural similes, which he was very, very earthy and very fond of these kind of similes, he said it's like a rice farmer. He does a lot of work plowing the field and planting the rice seedlings, and that's all necessary for the rice to grow. But he can't actually make the rice grow. And if he was to go down into the field and tug on the rice plants to try and make them grow, he would just kill them. So it's like that. You have to do a lot of work and a lot of preparing of the way and the ground to make liberation possible. But in the end, you don't do it. There's no way you can do it. You could make it happen. You plant the rice and then you let it sprout. And planting the rice is a long, laborious process. It's not an easy task, rice farming, nor is it an easy task to attain liberation. But in the end, the rice grows on its own, and the mind is liberated on its own. So I'll stop there and look at the chat now for questions. It seems like there's stuff in the chat already. We'll see if any of them have taken the form of a question. Is the experience of unconditioned similar to the Nirodha? I recently read about Palasampati, which is described as the mental experience of Nibbana sensation. Is this supported by other suttas or later edition, or is the experience of Nibbana for stream enter more cognitive? Well, Nirodha cessation is a particular mind state that occurs immediately prior to liberation. That Nirodha cessation is like the ending of samsara, and then there's liberation and the realization of nibbana. And the experience of nibbana as cognitive, it makes it, for the stream winner, it makes fundamental cognitive change, but it goes than merely cognitive. It incorporates that, but it goes beyond that. The experience of stream entries to witness some ignorance be extinguished from the mind. Since the self is tied up with ignorance, the dissolution of ignorance by wisdom also dissolves the self. Yes, okay, that's not a question, but it's. I don't see anything wrong with that statement. Okay. With advancements in technology, specifically internet, do you think it's easier for lay people to attain levels of awakening without a formal teacher or be in a Buddhist environment? I don't know if, it certainly increases the ease of access to the teachings. I don't think it would directly make attaining awakening any easier. I mean, it's still what it's always been. And you can listen to all the Dhamma talks you want, but you still have to do the inner work on your own. Can you please discuss a little more about your last comments about liberation, like rice planting? I don't know what else to say about it. It's the analogy is that preparing the field and planting the rice, which is time-consuming and laborious and difficult, is like doing the work of the practice. But then the sprouting of the rice just happens naturally. It's not something you can force. You can't force the rice to grow. So that's like the liberation of the mind. It just when you've done all the preparatory work, that becomes possible, but you don't actually do it. The example of shunning routines as a form of negative Sīlabbataparāmāsa reminds me of secular Buddhism advocates. Is it accurate to characterize that as a form of Sīlabbataparāmāsa? It can be. I don't think it necessarily is in all cases, but I have encountered people who are very dogmatic, let's say, about refusing to do any ritualistic act. Like bowing to the Buddha Rupa or lighting a candle or whatever it might be, or those sorts of things. Just, someone who's dogmatically attached to ritualistic behavior, we can easily see that as Sīlabbataparāmāsa. But if you're dogmatically opposed to it, absolutely, then that's also a form of dogmatism, and it comes from a kind of negative Sīlabbataparāmāsa. What I heard, proficiency in Vipassana is absolutely essential for stream entry. Is that correct? I would give that a qualified yes. Qualified because it depends how you define Vipassana. As I said in the talk, Vipassana is really a state of mind. It's not a particular meditation. So I think there probably have been and are beings who attain to that state of mind without doing any of the formal techniques. I think that's pretty rare, and it's probably due to previous lifetimes of work. But I would hesitate to say that any technique is absolutely essential, as a prerequisite. In most cases, I would say for almost everybody, it is necessary to have some deep mastery of the practice of formal meditation. According to Sutta, it appears that Nibbana can be attained either by going through the formless jhanas and nirodha or by developing insight powered by the rupa jhanas. Is this correct? Yeah, this is a whole, open up a whole nother can of worms, the relationship of jhana and Magapala, path and fruit, or liberation, awakening. On the one hand, in the Abhidhamma, it's clearly specified that jhana has to precede liberation. And in the suttas, when the Buddha talks about paths taken to liberation, he has there are some variations, but he almost always talks about first, second, third, fourth jhana, and then the mind emerging from jhana, attaining to liberation. There is a brief mention, without any development, of a bare insight without jhana. This is mentioned in the suttas, but not developed. And that becomes the kernel for the later development of bare insight schools and methods, particularly in Myanmar. But even there, if you, I've studied the writings of Mahasi Sayadaw, who is often thought of as advocate of bare insight, but he says there's a momentary jhana preceding stream entry. So he also is, like most of the Burmese, he's also very steeped in Abhidhamma. So there's still the idea that there's at least a moment of jhana before liberation. So can it be deduced that a person with OCD cannot be a Sotapanna, OCD being an extreme case of Sīlabbataparāmāsa? Yeah, I would say that if someone has OCD, then that's a sign that they're not a stream enterer. In the Thai forest tradition, the Ajahns emphasize the contemplation of the body as a path to attaining Sotapanna. However, personality of the suttas comprise all five aggregates as in the body. Is body-centric practice appropriate? Yeah, the body is taken as a object of meditation because it's really basic, and it's somehow easier to deal with in most cases than the mind. But any of seeing the three characteristics in any of the aggregates will get you through. There's nothing wrong with looking at the different aggregates, but the body has traditionally been the main vehicle because it's coarse and easy to see. Are there any records of Silabbataparāmāsa ever being mistreated and presented so that one can be lax in Buddhist history? Um, well, I'm not sure if it was ever phrased in that way, but some of the early schools of Buddhism, um, they did develop uh, what some what's sometimes called in history of religion an antinomian approach, in that they radically rejected any rules, and this is kind of the the seed of the tantric stuff. You know that the and in some ways that's again a negative form of Sīlabbataparāmāsa. But there have been some deviant schools of Buddhism in India that would deliberately break precepts, for example, thinking that this was a way of liberating the mind. I thought if something was only mentioned once in the suttas, that we shouldn't put much weight on it. Um, yeah, that's probably a good rule of thumb. If something's only mentioned once in the suttas, you can have a reasonable suspicion that, certainly not a certainty, but you can have a suspicion that maybe it was added later. Something somebody put in to round it out to fit their view. Have you ever had encounters of people with psychic powers? No comment. In the mention of dry insight in the suttas, Bhikkhu Bodhi states it is dry due to lack of formless jhanas and not because of being devoid of rupa jhanas. Do you agree with this? Well, that's an interpretation. I don't know if it's correct or not, because as I said in the sutta, it's just a briefest mention, so it's not. So you can read it in different ways. I think that reading of Bhikkhu Bodhis there is a possible. It's a possibly valid interpretation, but I wouldn't put too much weight on it. Would you give advice to someone who's going through a lot of emotional pain and suffering from great loss? Is it better to suffer the pain intensely or distract oneself with mundane activities? I don't think distracting with mundane activities is the wisest course, but it's also not helpful in the long run to wallow in misery. Um, uh, it's natural when you suffer great loss. There's going to be an emotional downturn, but then you have to find a way out of that. One way is, to recognize that loss is a natural part of life. That this is samsara. Beings are born, beings die, and come to abandon your um, attachment and desire for reality to be otherwise. Are the monks chanting and ringing bells a case of developing metta and not a ritual or rite? No, it is a ritual, but it's not. You know, it's the attitude you have towards the ritual that determines whether it's Sīlabbataparāmāsa or not. In your opinion, are the rupa jhanas a state devoid of any of the five senses, including loss of intention, as taught by some monks? Um, well, there is a diminution of the senses through first jhana, and second jhana you're quite secluded from the senses. Um, and as you progress through the jhanas, then intention would diminish as well. Okay, I think we'll call it a close now. And next time we're going to do Wichikicha, Skeptical Doubt. That'll be the end of the first series relating to stream entry, and then we move on to the middle fetters. Okay. Okay. Best wishes to all of you.